Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy, and we're all here to discuss Olympic curling, right? I'm sorry, that's the other room. Anyway, we seem to be starting off this semester's fellowship presentations with a hefty dose of outstanding writing. Earlier this week, we heard from novelist Maza Mengista, and I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Anna Maria Kellen lecture, Facing Mortality in Gardens Along the Seine, which will be delivered by Rachel Cohen, professor of practice in the arts at the University of Chicago. So it is a special pleasure to welcome so many faces from the Berlin art community here to the Wannsee. In fact, the Wannsee itself is very well represented because we have Villa Liebermann and Wannsee Contemporary, both well represented here tonight. We have Potsdam's Museum Barberini and a whole host of other institutions of art and art scholarship, and what could be better? Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a word about the fellowship that makes tonight's event possible. The Academy's Anna Maria Kellen Fellowship is named after Anna Maria Kellen, who was born in 1918 and who lived until 2017, a good long life. She was one of the daughters of Hans and Ludmila Arnold, and indeed she spent her childhood in this very villa during the 1920s before continuing her studies in Switzerland and France. After the Arnold family fled the Nazis and emigrated to the United States in 1933, Anna Maria Arnold married Stephen M. Kellen, a fellow Berliner who also had left Germany in 1936, and he later became president of the family bank, Bankhaus Arnold and Bleichroeder. Over 6 decades later, in 1997, Anna Maria Kellen and Stephen M. Kellen made their founding gift to establish the American Academy in Berlin, which provided for the renovation of this house, which had taken a bit of a beating over 4 decades as a club for the U.S. Army in Berlin, and to establish the basis of our endowment. And since then, the Kellen-Arnold family has continued their more than generous support of the institution, and we are profoundly grateful for that. It is my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Cohen as this semester's Anna Maria Kellen Fellow at the Academy. And I have to say, when I recall the stories that I heard about what this home was like in the 1920s, as musicians like Paderewski came and went, and writers and artists, and what an idyllic place of culture and repose it was, then I think that, and I think about that period that they were living, perhaps unknowingly, perched on the edge of a volcano. This seems like a particularly good pairing of fellow and fellowship. So Rachel Cohen is an acclaimed writer and scholar whose work bridges literature, art history, and cultural criticism. Rachel is currently completing her 4th book, Time in Pieces, Artists at Work, a study examining how artists experience and represent time, from fleeting moments to the longue durée. This project explores how painters and printmakers across eras have grappled with time, imaginative time, photographic time, cyclical time, nonlinear sequences. Her research spans Edo period Japan, the French Impressionists, the Surrealists, as far afield as Mexico City, and abstract expressionism. And a central insight of Rachel Cohen in this work is her observation that each historical moment feels time has a distinctive feel, a different sense, an awareness sharpened by all those contemporary concerns. And in our case, in particular, rapid technological change, climate anxiety, political upheaval. Her project also considers how technological innovation, for example, the advent of photography, influenced artists like Claude Monet, how it reshaped artistic perception and the very idea of representation. And if you think this sounds like a great project, you're in good company. And I know I'm looking forward to hearing more about it tonight. Rachel Cohen holds an AB, that special kind of bachelor's that you can get only at Harvard, I think. Everywhere else, it's a BA. And she joined, I'm telling the truth here, that's what they call it there. And she joined the University of Chicago faculty in 2016 after many years teaching creative writing at St. Lawrence. I'm sorry. I'm not entirely back yet. At Sarah Lawrence College, there's a big difference between Sarah Lawrence and St. Lawrence, and ice hockey is only part of it. She is the author of 3 widely praised books. Austin Years, a memoir in 5 novels, which was published by one of this Academy's very favorite publishing houses, Farrar, Straus and Giroux. That's because it belongs to one of our trustees, and is her most recent, and recounts how the close reading of Jane Austen got her through a rich but profoundly challenging period of life. She's also the author of Bernard Berenson, A Life in the Picture Trade, which was published in 2013 and is part of the Yale Jewish Lives series about that fascinating, changeable, impoverished Lithuanian Jewish immigrant who became an American cultural grandee and the interpreter of the Italian Renaissance for the American public. Her first book, A Chance Meeting, intertwined lives of American writers and artists, was reissued for its 20th anniversary by the New York Review of Books Classics in 2024. Her essays, blending biography, criticism, memoir, and lyrical reflection, have appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, the New York Times, and they've been anthologized in Best American Essays. So as someone who had an unexpected amount of time on my hands recently, mostly in bed, like probably a lot of you, I know I'm not unique in this regard. I've been leafing through much of Rachel's work, and I can only attest that she has a beautiful prose style, a profound sensitivity, and she is a delight to read. Beyond her writing, Rachel Cohen is engaged in public-facing scholarship, leading close reading sessions on artworks for audiences in Chicago and online, and she is contributing to the collaborative initiatives such as the Migration Stories Project. Her work has been supported by fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, from the MacDowell Colony, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. And it's worth adding that while in Germany, Rachel is particularly interested to engage with the works of Paula Modersohn-Becker and her artistic and intellectual connections with Rilke, among others. So just a bit of housekeeping. Rachel's talk will last about 35 minutes and will be followed by Q&A. If you're with us here at the Academy, raise your hand, wait for the microphone, ask a question. If you're joining us via Vimeo, please type your question in the Q&A part of the platform. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you to Daniel Benjamin for that really gracious introduction. A warm thanks to everyone here at the Academy who've been creating such a beautiful space for us to work in. I'm really grateful to be here. And a special thanks to all my fellow fellows. It's an honor and a pleasure to be working side by side with you. Many thanks to all of you for coming this evening, and to those of you who are online for being here this evening. As Dan Benjamin mentioned, my project here at the Academy is to work on the research and writing of a book called Time in Pieces, and I'll be presenting one strand of that book, thinking about gardens, about violence, about loss, and especially about divides here this evening. The artists I'll think about with you are scattered over 175 years and 3 continents. They work in media from contemporary film and performance installation to large-scale paintings in series and multi-panels to woodblock prints. The idea of dividing is important in all these media. where are the edges? Where are the breaks? And how does one get across the breaks? Or does one really want to get across the breaks? What do you do with the breaks? Dividing, I think, is related to two things that I'm particularly interested to think about, both of which have to do with our experiences of time right now. I think probably many of you have had these two experiences. One is of being utterly distracted and feeling that every second is divided into small pieces of seconds, and that the phone messages are coming in and the bad news is coming in, and you're just like in an endless, fragmented kind of broken apart present. And the other is that somehow this present is cut off from both the past and the future, and that you are kind of isolated in this present moment. And I think these two experiences of time are related. And I also think that they're ones which people in other historical moments have had analogous or related experiences of as technology has changed in different times. So that's a kind of overall interest of mine that I think you'll see running through some of what I'm going to talk about here this evening. So let's go to somewhere pretty, because it's cold and it's gray. So we're going to the Seine. We're going. This is the river. It's a little north of Paris, and you can see two towns where we're going to be focusing our attention here this evening: Giverny and Vétheuil. In Giverny, we're going to look at the works of both Claude Monet and the contemporary performance artist Ottavia Gary. In Vétheuil, we'll look at Monet with Joan Mitchell, the abstract expressionist painter Joan Mitchell. So in Giverny, here are two little bits of Monet and two little bits of Gary. You're probably familiar with the Monet of this period. He lived in Giverny for 40 years, and he had a very long life. He lived until 1926, much longer than many of the other French Impressionists. And he worked incredibly hard in his gardens. He's known for loving flowers, painting them, but also really raising them and spending a lot of time devoted to them. And he said, more than anything, I must have flowers, always, always. Here are some pictures of his gardens in their current restored state. There's his pink house and the flowers that he prided himself on. Two views from the Japanese bridge. And here, is this a kind of familiar image to many of you? Yes, this is a classic, right? Everybody's seen this bridge, yes. So this one is actually at the Art Institute of Chicago, where I live. It's a very old friend of mine, and I wanted to show you not only the Art Institute's picture, which is this one, but my picture. Can you see how different it is? I find I take a lot of photographs. That's part of my practice. I probably have 100,000 photographs of paintings at this point. And when you take your own photographs, you learn about the balance of colors. The Art Institute has a very specific thing that it wants its paintings to look like, but they miss the reds. So you see there's a lot more red in my blurry homemade photograph. I also like that my own photographs feel a little bit more like actually being in the presence of a painting. I think maybe you think, well, that's a photograph I could have taken, and also you feel a little more connected to the actual brush strokes. One thing that I'm really interested in this painting is the way that the bridge, you sort of think that it must be a curved bridge, symmetrical, and that it goes down, but it doesn't go down. It just goes right off the edge of the painting. And you can see it just bluntly hits the edge there. And that's something that Monet was really interested in learning. Maybe all of you are familiar with this from Japanese artists. There was this huge influx of Japanese woodcuts that came into France in this time, and the special cropping and way that those woodblock prints are done was something that he was thinking about a lot. And it's also a feature of photography, of course, that you have different and surprising frames that cut things in new ways different than painting. So you can see him responding to new stimulation in a painting that looks to us very classic now. I think we sort of forget how many new things were happening in this painting. This is another painting of the same bridge by Monet, made in 1918, 18 years later. His vision had changed a lot. This is the whole painting. It's very hard to see the bridge, but you can barely make it out. And of course, you can still see some of the verticals of the falling wisteria and willows. And Monet worked all the way through World War I, and that's one of the main kind of things that I want to talk about this evening, is kind of working through violent times. So he said, I resumed work. It's the best way to avoid thinking of these sad times. All the same, I feel ashamed to think about my little researches into form and color while so many people are suffering and dying for us. Monet's garden was right by the front. It was a couple of miles from the front of World War I. He could hear artillery fire as he was painting. The ambulance drivers were bringing the wounded and the dead back right by the garden. So those paintings that we think of as so beautiful and transcendently peaceful were painted literally in the middle of the war. He had a son and a stepson at the front. So, and here he's painting willows, which are a tree of mourning. So like a weeping willow, that cries and grieves. And the film that he was in here is a film made by Sacha Guitry. It was a propaganda film. It was a film celebrating French artists in the middle of the war. And it's interesting to me that he agreed to be in it because he felt it was part of the war effort. It also meant that he was one of the first visual artists painters to be filmed working. And here you can see him. So this is the kind of painting he was working on. This is a 1917 painting, and our friends from Potsdam who are here may recognize. I took this last week at the Barberini Museum. Thank you for making me welcome there. And this kind of falling down vertical that you see, and the kind of waviness of it is characteristic of the water lily paintings. Here are some more, two details from the Barberini and one from the Musée, from the Orangerie. It was Monet's idea, these paintings that he made all during the war, he had the idea that these were going to be paintings that he could give to the country of France after the war, and that they would make a kind of place of peace and rest for people in the time of healing that he hoped was going to come after the war. And this is, in fact, what happened after he died in 1926. And if you've been at the Orangerie in Paris, it's an oval curved space, and the paintings are installed in an oval all around you. And it is a very beautiful place of contemplation. The person who really presided over the installation was Georges Clemenceau, the statesman and person who was really in charge of France during the war. And he used to come out and visit Monet all the time at Giverny. And he made sure to do it kind of according to what he thought Monet would have wanted. Clemenceau said that the action across this battlefield is life itself. It doesn't look like a battlefield to me, but it's interesting that you can see it in there. Another Giverny artist. So now we come to Jatavia Gary, who made this 3-channel film installation called the Giverny Suite in 2019. it was completed in 2019, and then it was installed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2023 and 2024, where some of you may have seen it. It's a film loop. It plays for 40 minutes, and then it picks back up again. And so here's Jatavia Gary, an artist portrait and part of the film, a still from the film. And when she applied to work in Giverny, she told me in an interview I did with her that she wasn't sure that the people would understand the thing that she was applying to do, but in fact that she felt that her own artwork was quite impressionistic in terms of the cutting, the fact that these are, in my mind, cinematic poems. And I find that very interesting to think about cutting as a subject of impressionistic work. Certainly cutting things into series, cutting moments out was something that Claude Monet was doing. And here's her, you see these are the water lilies in her installation. Is this one the video? No. And here you can see that's her in a character that she calls La Negresse, and she Nina Simone, familiar also to most of you. So Nina Simone is an important figure for Jatavia Gary, and one we'll keep hearing from. What Jatavia Gary was doing was juxtaposing a lot of different materials. Her three screens are also kind of like the big array of paintings that Monet made for the Orangerie. They're a surround, and they are kind of a multiple experience in the way that he also was interested to accomplish. And he himself makes some cameo appearances in her film. There's Nina Simone against the French landscape. Another thing that Jatavia Gary did is interview young women and women of all ages and girls about whether they felt safe in their bodies. And she played another character to do that in this, a kind of interviewing character. So you can see this is a girl, and those are Nina Simone's hands. And another person who appeared in this is Fred Hampton, who's a Chicago figure who was murdered by the police. And the theme of being killed by the police is important in this work. This happened in the summer of 2016 that Jatavia Gary made this work, and you may remember that was an election summer for the United States. And it was also the summer when Philando Castile was killed, and his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, his partner, Diamond Reynolds, videotaped it, so the video was available of the killing. And it was an early instance of that kind of filming, which we've now unfortunately grown still more used to. So thinking about that was part of what Jatavia Gary was having to reconcile when she was in the beautiful place of Giverny. She was trying to figure out, how do I remain aware of both of these things, this garden and also this wider world. And her solution is partly to cut the things together in this way that you can sort of never be only in one or the other. Something that I find beautiful and touching is that one thing she did is she cut up flowers from Monet's garden and from Giverny, and she glued them onto the film, onto the celluloid to cover. She sampled some of Diamond Reynolds' film, but she covered the body of Philando Castile in the flowers so that you don't see the body's not exposed again to scrutiny. And it's like a kind of burial. Of course, we cover bodies with flowers in a mourning ceremony. So that I actually won't show those stills, but that's how she managed that death within her film. And you'll hear the voice of Diamond Reynolds in some of the other clips that I'm going to play, saying they shot my boyfriend, they shot him, so that the sound of the shots is like a cutting sound that comes into the film. She said that healing, she wanted healing to be at the root of the work. And here's another. Seeing that film is a very emotional experience. I saw it many times in the time that I was writing about it, and it's very powerful, I think. And this is drone footage against Giverny footage, another juxtaposition. So now let's go down the river to Vétheuil, because I want to tell you that all of these things had happened in a way before, even though not quite the same, even though some circumstances different. But so here's Claude Monet, a young man in the 1870s, ready to leave Paris and find a gardening life. So he's been painted by Pierre-Auguste Renoir in 1875. Now, maybe this is familiar territory to some of you, but it's something that's been interesting to me in recent studies, that I think people are more and more seeing that French Impressionism really grew out of the Franco-Prussian War, that the Franco-Prussian War was from 1870 to 1871. The first major French Impressionist exhibition was 1874. In 1870 and 71, most of the French Impressionists left Paris. They had to get away to be safe. A few stayed in Paris. And then they all returned after, having survived in different ways. And it was important to them to try to think about a kind of art that came after that war. And another part of that experience was, as you know, the Franco-Prussian War was followed by the Paris Commune, because the French government conceded very quickly to the Prussian army, and the Parisians didn't want to concede, and they were also angry about other things that the French government was doing, and they elected the Paris Commune. And then the French government suppressed the Paris Commune. So the French government executed many hundreds, thousands of people in Paris. So Paris suffered two sieges. First, there was the siege of the Prussians, and then there was the siege of the French government. So in a moment where we're thinking a lot, I think, about cities under siege from federal forces, it's interesting to remember this moment and to think that the Impressionists were very aware of that. They had a lot of friends in the commune. There were a couple of things that you can see this, you can see some of this in some famous paintings that Monet made in 1877. These are paintings from the Gare Saint-Lazare. There are two of them, and I've put them next to each other so you can sort of see the series and see them repeating. Railroads had been an important part of the war. Prussian superiority and railroads had been important to them winning the war. And the French felt that they needed to catch up. Railroads were also changing the time conditions of France at this time, and of Europe and of the United States. Because railroads require coordination of time across larger distances. Instead of having like a local church clock that tells you what time it is, and that clock maybe is a few minutes different than the one in the next village, all time has to be coordinated or trains crash. So there's a huge movement to coordinate time, which is still very much like what we experience now. Our time is infinitesimally coordinated, like every split second is coordinated across the globe, and everything depends on that, all business, all internet, all traffic. The the railroad time was coordinated officially, there was officially Greenwich Mean Time in 1884, which is 7 years after these paintings are made. So Claude Monet was thinking about these aspects of railroads as he was painting. He painted 12 of the railroads, and these are 8 of them. And you can really start to see something coming, which is the series paintings that he started to do, all the haystacks, all the bridges, all those paintings where each painting shows a different hour of the day, different weather conditions, and they make a series that's almost like a film where you have the stills of the film. And it's your job as a viewer to fill in the space between the paintings, as it's your job to fill in that bridge that goes beyond the edge of the painting. The friend of the Impressionists, Émile Zola, the journalist, was one of the first people into Paris. He was reporting from the Commune, and he said this thing that I think is important. He said, "It will take a great deal of gentleness to heal the million people suffering nightmares, those who have emerged shivering from the fire and massacre." And that really became a part of what the Impressionists were doing, I think, that they were thinking about gentleness, and they were thinking about the human body in space. And that's also been interesting to me to learn over time. We're used to the idea that the Impressionists create perception of movement, but also part of what they were doing was, like the abstract expressionists, creating a sense of the body, of the artist moving, and of our own bodies moving in response to the paintings that they were making. So Monet moved out of Paris. He went to Vétheuil. This painting is from the Alte Nationale Gallery. I've also enjoyed visiting with this one. You can see the curve of the river and a woman sitting there. And these are garden paintings, also from Vétheuil. The one on the right is from the Barberini, and this one is from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And at this time, he also painted his wife. This is an 1875 portrait of her. And unfortunately, the year after they moved to Vétheuil, Camille Monet died. And so she's buried in a cemetery in Vétheuil. And that was one of the losses that Monet was contending with in the gardens that he was building there. Joan Mitchell moved to Vétheuil some 80 years later in 1968, and she used to say to people of Camille Monet, "You know we are neighbors," because the cemetery ran right next to Joan Mitchell's house, and she could look out and see where Camille Monet was buried. These are their houses. That's Claude Monet's house in orange in the front, and that's Joan Mitchell's house, the one with the tower, in the back. So they really could not be closer. They are neighbors. And it's interesting that Joan Mitchell moved, it was then called the Avenue Claude Monet. It was already known as Monet territory when she decided to move there. Here she is in the gardens. This is her studio, and this is her with her friends J.J. Mitchell and Chris Larson, who were poets. Loss is here too, in fact, because J.J. Mitchell was the boyfriend of Frank O'Hara and had been with Frank O'Hara the night that Frank O'Hara was killed in an accident. And Chris Larson, unfortunately, would commit suicide not too long after this picture was taken. So there was a lot, Mitchell had a lot of death surrounding her as part of the work that she was doing. And she moved to Vétheuil partly because both of her parents had died. She had inheritance money and it allowed her to buy the house. But it meant that the house itself kind of came from the losses. These are classic Joan Mitchell paintings of the 1950s before she moved out to Vétheuil. Kind of dense, often horizontal, abstract expressionist works. But once she moved out, she started painting more vertically. And this painting of sunflowers is a radiant one. It's my detail on the left, and then the whole painting is on the right. One thing that I think is interesting is that she made this shift from painting more horizontally to painting more vertically. And if you think about it, a vertical painting is a portrait and a horizontal painting is a landscape. She was painting landscape, but she was painting horizontally. she was painting vertically, she shifted. And vertical painting is related to the body in a different way. You feel it almost like more like a person. You relate to it shoulder to shoulder. And you can have a sense of somebody moving through a landscape by seeing a vertical painting. You can also see that she must have been thinking of Monet when she made her sunflowers, and also of Van Gogh. So one thing that Mitchell started to do in this time was she really started to paint these multi-panel paintings like this one. And this one is from 1992 toward the end of her life, still in a related palette, though with different kinds of paints. But here what she's doing is she's actually doing the kind of series that Monet is doing, but she's doing it all in one painting. So she's putting 2 paintings together, or sometimes 4 or 5 paintings together, and making a whole, a kind of a whole world in one, many iterations in one painting. These are some details of her painting. When she spoke with an interviewer, Linda Nochlin, about this, she said, I like the vertical, I like the cutting. And Linda Nochlin said, you like those divisions? And Joan Mitchell said, yeah. I think that that's a really nice understatement. She made like 300 of these paintings. She really liked these divisions, you know. But it's interesting that division is the word that they came up with for this thing, which is often the negative thing that we feel in our broken instants and our broken minutes. But somehow by emphasizing the division, she's able to create a feeling of wholeness. You look back and forth across the seam of the painting, and you start to be part of a time experience that has a kind of loop to it. And being in that loop, as being in Jatavia Gary's loop, is an experience of presence that's really quite striking. And I find it interesting that the emphasis of division can create a sustained presence. I think if Cézanne's apples show you, say, multiple sides of an apple at the same time, what Mitchell's multi-panels are showing you are different sides of a feeling or a memory or a color experience. And holding them together is an exercise in presence. Mitchell was very close to a lot of the New York School poets, and they too are able to create a feeling of being very present in their poems. You are in the middle of the poem, and it's happening all around you as you're reading. And these painters really these poets really loved Monet, and the abstract expressionist painters really loved Monet. And Frank O'Hara started he was one of the people who was kind of encouraging the MoMA to start collecting late Monet, so that in the mid-50s, Monet became a real presence for the abstract expressionists. And I find it interesting to say, look at this late Monet with the Joan Mitchell. There have been some wonderful exhibitions of their 2 works together in recent years. But look at those 2 details. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. When Mitchell was finished figuring out how panels went together, she would often make a brushstroke like this to seal the divide between the 2 paintings. This is something that Frank O'Hara said. It is not surprising that faced with universal destruction, as we are told, our art should at last speak with unimpeded force and unveiled honesty to a future which may well be non-existent in a last effort of recognition, which is the justification of being. This is a little bit of a letter that Joan Mitchell wrote to her dear friend Giselle Barrault. And I think you can see, she's written the loss. This was after the deaths of her analyst, whom she loved, and her sister was ill. And can you see that she's underscored each loss? There are 2 lines. They look like they're meeting, but they don't quite meet. Two of our artists talk about cutting, the vertical, the cutting, quite impressionistic in terms of the cutting. Now, this is the most difficult bit of the video that I'm going to show from Jatavia Gary. But she said when she got to Giverny that it felt like a stage set, that it felt like it was behind glass. It needed, she said, a primal scream. And that she had other reasons for wanting to scream because this was that terrible summer, as I've described. You can see her on the bridge there. When I talked to her, she said to me, in the edit, I catch the scream from myself, right? I love that because it's true, she does. She catches the scream in her hand, and it's like this loop of continuity and discontinuity. I mean, it's like this kind of way of holding and not being able to hold at the same time. The piece also has these altars that are flower altars dedicated to Yoruba deities, to Yamaya and Oshun. And they connect, the flowers then connect to people one might think of as being on the other side, beyond some kind of break. And interestingly, they also, to my eye, resemble in a way the Joan Mitchell. And a curator pointed out to me that he saw, Simon Kelly, that he saw a flower, a sunflower in that painting there. All right, bridges. So there's one more group of artists who I haven't had a chance to talk about yet, who were very important to Monet, and those were the Japanese artists who were working in what was called Edo and is now called Tokyo. So I want to bring those works into the conversation as I draw things together here. This is Monet's house on the inside. Have you been? Do you remember? Have you seen? It's lined with Japanese prints. He had 250 of them, maybe 300 of them. He collected them from every dealer he could find. It was a obsession second only to gardening. He also had 6 gardeners working for him by the end of his time. And he knew everybody who was interested in Japanese art, including people from Japan who were coming as representatives. He had Japanese friends, and he was completely. He moved into Japanese prints. This is his hallway with this famous Hiroshige of the rain over the bridge, like on the stairway there. And this is a different Hiroshige that I find very resonant, that's also of a half-moon bridge. And it's from the series 100 Famous Views of Edo, which was very important for the Impressionists in thinking about series work and thinking about what it is to see something from different perspectives and to keep rotating your perspective as you moved, say, around Edo. So here are the 2 bridges, and you can see the verticals also, the way that the living trees and the living wisteria are the verticality. That interested me, and so those are my notes. I drew it, but often I do find that drawing is a way for me to understand something about the works that I'm studying. And here are tiny figures on the bridge in the Hiroshige and in the Gary. And I think that makes a relation to your own body. And I noticed when I was in the space of the Jatavia Gary that the way people were moving around in the space showed the way that their bodies were responding to the work that they were seeing. It makes a kind of a bridge. A bridge to me is beautiful. I like the idea of getting from one side to the other, said Joan Mitchell. There's a lot to say about bridges because Mitchell had lived near bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge and Paris bridges, but also Mitchell's grandfather was a bridge builder. He was a civil engineer, and one of his bridges was taken down in 1956, which was the year that she made her first multi-panel painting, her first diptych, and her first diptych was called The Bridge. And there it is. And I think it's really interesting that her bridge also runs into a cut. It seems to fall into that break between the two panels, or to abut there, almost pointing to the seam or the break. And working on this talk, I thought about Monet's Japanese bridge, and I wondered about putting them together. And when I tried it, I was interested to see that I think it's actually very resonant. I lined it up so that the cut was the same. You can see, I think, this painting from the Art Institute of Chicago is the one that Joan Mitchell would have grown up knowing because she grew up in Chicago. And it came into the collection in 1933 when she was 7 or 8. So it's the painting she would have known from childhood and that she would have seen repeatedly as she was growing up. When she bought her house in Vétheuil, she said that she was buying it with her bridge money because it was the inheritance from her grandfather. But I think it's also expressive of the artistic inheritance that she had. A bridge, of course, is also a word in music, especially jazz, for the music that gets you across to the next idea. Jatavia Gary told me that when she was coming of age, she used to come home and put headphones on and just listen again and again to Nina Simone's unbelievable performance of Feelings at the Montreux Jazz Festival. And in a way, I think the Giverny suite is as much about moving into the work of Nina Simone as it is about moving into the work of Monet. All of these artists are just moving in, you know. Mitchell just literally moves in with on the Avenue Claude Monet, and Monet moves into Japanese prints. And Jatavia Gary moved in also in her own way. And this is an interesting way of thinking about what the resonance among artists can be, how artists can express influence when they're separated at a long distance of time from the people who they're learning from. So I'm going to close by showing you one of the revolving moments in the 40-minute loop of Jatavia Gary's piece that I come back to often. It's a moment after Diamond Reynolds' shattered voice has expressed something of what she's experiencing, and it moves to Nina Simone, who's also in a very shattered state and who is moving back and forth between being shattered and some other kind of experience. But toward the end of this moment, she kind of extends the bridge to us, or anyway, you can see the edge of it coming up to the broken space. She says, come on, you know this song. So here we go.
Oh, this feeling never comes again. Feelings like I never lost you. Feelings like I never had you. Here in my arms. Come on, let's hit the climax. Feel it. You know the song. Oh. Come on, you know this song. All of us can be the bridge. Thank you very much. Now I'm really delighted to take questions if you have questions. And I think somebody has a microphone. Ah, yes, somebody does.
On. Yeah, I can. Thank you so much, Rachel. This is really beautiful, and it's so interesting to see how you weave it all together and find these similarities. I guess I'm wondering what you think is going on in the subconscious of all of the art of these artists. Like, you're drawing these connections, but do you feel like there was, I mean, you had said, if you see the same, the Joni Mitchell, she had seen the painting
Right.
growing up. And do you feel like there's something subconscious going on where the similarities are coming together in the art form that's being expressed, or is it that it is the job of the viewer to make these connections, kind of?
Yeah, it's a nice question. Thank you, Sabrina. Yeah, I guess I would say I think there's some of both. I think, artists have incredible visual memories. That's like a part of being an artist, really. So I think when an artist has a strong visual experience, it really lodges. So for Joan Mitchell, say, going to the Art Institute as she did repeatedly all the way through her growing up, those paintings were really in her mind, and she didn't just know, like, she was a person who had like a almost synesthetic sense of color. Like, certain shades of color were incredibly important to her. She for a while was having an affair with Samuel Beckett, and they used to just walk around Paris and like name colors to each other. They were like color people, So you think, having that kind of color perception, you see a paint, you just don't forget it, So in that way, if there's a visual echo, I feel like there's, you can feel that was part of it. There's anxiety of influence too. Like, she was very influenced by Monet, but then she was also furious about being influenced by Monet, as people sometimes, and she would be like, actually, it's all about Van Gogh for me, forget Monet. And Van Gogh was really important to her. And she'd be like, people don't treat me properly, and they're feminizing me, and they're making me too pretty and too decorative and like Monet. And I'm actually like much fiercer and more like Van Gogh. So, and I'm not derivative anyway, so there was like there's all of that. That's complex. It's a different case, say, for Jatavia Gary, who, like, I don't think she particularly looks at Joan Mitchell. She's been at the MoMA a lot. She's seen Joan Mitchell, but it's not like that was a formative experience for her. So if I'm seeing a resonance there, or a similar color palette, or thinking these sunflowers are performing similar bridging functions in these two places, that's me. Like, that's my imagination. It's not that she's like trying to do Joan Mitchell. So I think they're different. There are different things. But I do think that artists are intellectuals, and they are building a sense of, and I speak as an artist, not just of artists, that we are building a sense of the patterns of influence that we're responding to. Artists spend a lot of time studying the works of other artists, so that it's important to recognize the kind of intellectual foundations that they themselves are making in their work. And so I'm trying to do that, as well as kind of saying, like, I see a pattern here, and maybe this is a pattern they would have agreed with. Yeah. That's a good question.
Rachel, that was really beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm trying to articulate this as I'm thinking about it, but I wondered if you could talk a bit more about time across these three artists, because I was struck by maybe the static medium that's being used, let's say with Monet and Mitchell, and yet the sense of movement within. And then, but Jatovia is quite literally working with movement and looping.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could just talk a bit more about how these artists are working with time, or maybe the increments of time, in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. It's so much the theme of what I'm thinking about. One thing I think about the kind of feeling for time there's so many different things that we mean when we say time. Like there's, dinner time and the days of the week time and daytime and nighttime. And there's also, my watch and how long do I have and mortality. And it's not an accident that the word time does for all those things. Like it's not that we should have different words for those things. They all in some way participate in a larger sense of time. But I think disentangling it is interesting and complex in the case of each artist. So say something like for Monet, for example, when he started to make those later paintings, part of what he was interested in was a feeling of immersion, like he stopped having the borders define a kind of scene and you just have a kind of endlessness. You have an abstract feeling. And that was something that the abstract expressionists really also wanted in their work, so that somehow the edges are not very clear. Like the edges of this Alex Katz are like it's very defined, it's a portrait and it's very defined how that figure sits in that space. But the edges of that Julie Moretu that's behind you are like, it's much more of an overall pattern and it's much more kind of moving. And so I think those create really different time experiences for the viewer. It's a different sense of what you're entering into, how long it lasts. To me, this is a kind of confrontation. It creates an immediate experience, but I can kind of enter a Julie Moretu and spend time there and become in a way less aware of time passing. So I find that also interesting. And I think with Jatavia Gary, the thing that one thing that I think about is she told me that the first film she made was an 8-minute film, and then she built it out to this bigger 40-minute loop. And she said she always wanted it to be something bigger, that it needed to be larger. And so she moved it spatially onto 3 screens, and it has that settee that sits in the middle of the space. So it makes really a very large installation. But it's interesting that it had to expand in time. Like it had to be 40 minutes long to reach like the scope that she wanted. And I think that that's related, that that it needs to be something that you can enter and be in for a long time, and that staying there, you're going to have time to change in the time that you're there if you watch it through, and that anywhere you come in, you're aware that it is going to keep going without you when you leave. And that sense of the largeness of the loop is part of the ambition of the piece, because it's really a piece that wants to kind of remake art history. It's like a very, very ambitious piece of work. And I find that a very exciting kind of time scale to be working on. Yeah. My fellow fellows know just what to ask me.
I'll pick up the time theme as well and add some music. So you played the Debussy, and sometimes this music is described as impressionist music.
Yep.
Because it becomes spatial.
Yes.
And works with color and creates a suspension of time.
Yeah.
But it sounds as though in some ways Impressionism was swapping places with music by trying to create the sense of time in various ways. So there's a strange kind of arrangement with this changing of places between music and art, given that music was moving into space.
Yes. Yeah, that's super interesting, because music is always a time experience. You start at a beginning and it unfolds in time, and yes, I think that's really nice. And there may be a way that they sort of meet in film also, that there's a kind of way that film joins both of those things. The Debussy there, I feel I should say, is not part of the original film. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston made that the soundtrack of the video, and I liked it, so I left it that way. And I felt it helped with the mood. But it's appropriate because the French Impressionists were really kind of overlapping with the poets and the musicians of that moment. I like that idea very much, Stephen, that because I do think that the time got more defined for the painters, that there was a feeling that there was a kind of envelope of the painting and it could endure for a certain amount of time, the time of looking at it, the time that it would hold. The painters who painted in series like Monet and Pissarro, they're so funny to read their correspondence because they would get really desperate. They would be like, I can't bear it. These clouds are not holding in one place. I can't get them down fast enough. And Monet would have like 70 canvases that he was working on at the same time. And he would run between them as the effects changed, so and people would go to visit and he would be in a total state because he would need like an earlier thing that he couldn't find anymore. And the London fog had changed. And so it became very time bound and very weather bound, like this sort of specific rendering of these conditions. And I think it is interesting to think of music kind of spatializing in that time. One of the things I want to look into more while I'm here that I haven't really had a chance to read in as much, I'm interested to read more in, is thinking about the aspects of developments in physics that were happening at this same time. There's a well-known book called Einstein's Clocks that's about the development of the way that Einstein, sitting in the railway stations working on the problem of timetables for railroads, had some of the insights that became the theory of relativity and his sense of space-time. But I do think this question of like what the relationship is between space and time is really all the artists are thinking about it in this moment. And as you come across into the 20th century, it's a huge preoccupation. Here and then here. Go ahead and yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to switch from time to place.
Yeah.
Because obviously Mitchell and Gary were drawn to these places, which you would think would be the obvious reason of Monet's work. But then you would think, well, you can see them in the museums. Why do you have to be in the garden where they were made?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it's a beautiful garden, but there are many beautiful gardens in other places. And, so there's this kind of spirit of the place, I guess, that draws them there. But what about the idea of the refuge or the retreat or even the exile in this regard? I mean, I also think of James Baldwin in France and other artists and writers and how that might have spoken to Mitchell and Gary.
Yeah. There are a lot of interesting parts. Thank you for that question. I actually first saw Jatavia Gary's smaller Giverny film in a show that was at the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago that was about Black quietude and Black retreat and kind of thinking about finding sanctuaries or finding refuges. And so the word refuge is really resonant. I think there was definitely a sense in which she was thinking about refuge. What she told me was that she really didn't find a refuge in the place, that it was a very difficult place to be a Black woman and an American, that she felt frequently targeted or afraid for her physical safety, and had encounters that were really difficult. So I think she felt actually quite uneasy all the time that she was in Giverny, and she didn't like the kind of big tourist garden. And it was only when she was able to get there after hours and see it that she kind of felt some sense of retreat. And I think I'm guilty of it too. The pictures that I showed of the gardens make it look so beautiful, but in fact, I took carefully shots that didn't show the hundreds of other people who were there with me. The garden is full of people all the time. So I think it's a complicated thing. You do feel connected to Monet there, but you also feel part of a wave of tourists or other things. But I think, yeah, for Mitchell, I would say it's a little bit more a retreat because she was able to have a house and have space, and that was. But I did hear from a painter who used to go out and visit her that they would sit on the balcony and they would watch the tourist buses come through for the Monet house that was there. So there's a way in which you're living with the touristical memory of the earlier person that's maybe not the idealized sense of place. I think you were asking a deeper question, though, about whether there is a feeling of a place and whether you can catch hold of that and whether that really affects the making of art. It does seem to me that that was the case for both Mitchell and Gary, that they made work they would not have been able to make without being in those places. And I do think sometimes the feeling of seeing something, it's part of the joy of going to a museum and seeing a painting is that you feel you're seeing what the painter saw, you're seeing with the painter. And I think when you're in a landscape that painter has seen, you really feel that you're seeing together with that earlier person. So there's a kind of companionship in that maybe does create a feeling of groundedness for working. There was a question here, yeah.
Thank you for such an insightful talk. It was really fascinating. I also am curious about place as well, and bringing in the public and people and like the history of the folks who've come to these gardens and parks. And yeah, I'm curious about why you think these artists were so focused on these gardens. And you talked about divisions and fragments, and a garden is also in a way a fragment of nature, like larger nature, and is this artifact of colonialism. And so I'm curious about just like how you're thinking of the connections of peoples across from Europe to Japan, and as well the artists who have come to these gardens over many decades.
That's really, really helpful. I like that thought about the garden as a fragment. And when you say it's an artifact of colonialism, how are you thinking about that?
I'm thinking about like the botanical gardens and how they're a place where you could bring, or the colonizers can bring
all these plants from different places and regiment them. And that's a really nice thought. Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I think one set of things to say would be about those Monet gardens. I find it interesting. He had a lot of plants that came from different parts of the world. Like he had agapanthus from South Africa and he had bamboo from East Asia. And he brought these plants into the garden. They're still there. There's a big stand of bamboo and there's all these plants. It was a moment where there started to be this kind of horticultural trade and importing. He was friends with this guy who bred water lilies and brought them in from all over the place. And that was a kind of trade and colonial project. And I think his neighbors, Monet's neighbors, actually objected to him growing what they called foreign plants. So there was also like an interesting dimension of like xenophobia that came, where it was like he was bringing in these strangers and they didn't want these foreign plants. And he had to persuade them that the plants weren't going to drink more water than other. So there was this sort of resource dimension that was also fascinating. At the same time, I think Jatavia Gary had a sort of double sense of like Monet. Like on the one hand, I think she thought of him as part of this band of revolutionaries who really like tried to do something against the establishment. On the other hand, I think she thought of him as part of a colonial power. Like there he is in the white hat and the white suit, kind of like painting in leisure. And she had that settee that was in the center of the like that broken settee, and it's kind of meant to be an artifact of colonialism. It's meant to be like a certain kind of period of furniture. I think it's also meant to recall furniture in her grandparents' house, so that there's like everything has a double meaning. But I think that your thought about this sort of import and export and trade is a really interesting one. And there would be a whole other interesting thing to say about Japanisme and the kind of French fad for Japanese work, which was, on the one hand, I think Japanese work was, French art critics said Japanese work has changed French art as significantly as the rediscovery of Roman and Greek art changed the Italian Renaissance. It's like the biggest artistic thing that's happened in 19th century France. And I kind of think that's true. Like, it was an enormous cultural kind of outpouring. On the other hand, it was like highly Orientalist, the way they went about appropriating and assimilating that. So I feel like there's a lot of doubleness in all these things. And your question makes me think about those things. It's really helpful. Yeah. I see somebody at the back.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I would like to ask, like, regarding the gardening itself, like the act of gardening, if Monet talked about it a lot or wrote about it, like if he got involved himself in the whole digging and planting and kind of taking care of the plants, because I, like, being a gardener myself, I think growing a garden is like it's like peak control. Like, it's really obsessively controlling everything that's happening. While at the same time, it's like a constant experience of loss, because whatever you plant every year, you're gonna lose. Like, even the perennials, you never know how they come back. Now we have a heavy winter, so a lot of things died for sure. So it's a constant exercise of planting, losing, accepting the loss, and just replanting the next year and see how things go. So in a way, it's also the opposite of like control. Like, you have to just let go. Whereas he, like, the garden looks wild to me, like, or to the external, like the visitor, but it's highly controlled and maintained and curated. So I wonder how this goes together, because his paintings really don't seem to accept the loss. Like, they seem like obsessively trying to catch the moment, and kind of we look at it like 100 years later, these memories basically.
Yeah. What a lovely reflection. I think again, there would be many things to say. It's something I was thinking about in conjunction with this talk, that one break that we all go through is the winter, and we're all aware of it right now. And a garden really, it really gets cut in the you cut it back, you prune it back, and it also goes underground. And there is this question, as you said really beautifully, like, what will come up again? Will it be lost, or will it return? What's going to make it through the break? And on the other hand, spring seems always miraculously still to come. So it may not be the same plants, but there is something that returns in the next season. I think Monet was pretty involved in the actual gardening, and I don't know what he would have said about accepting its losses, but I find it interesting, all the physical things that there are pots in that slide, or maybe too far back for it to be worth it. I'm going to give you all migraines. But in this slide here, these pots on the ground, he loved those pots, and he took them with him. So when they left Vétheuil, he moved them to Giverny, and then he grew more things in them. So it was like he was like physically in the space a lot. And this Vétheuil garden, he really did himself. He didn't have a gardener at that time. And then he had 6 kids. He had 2 kids of his own and 4 stepkids, and he got them all working for him. So later he had like a gardening staff, but early on the kids would be, and there would like the pump would break, and they would all be up all night, like pumping water so that they could water the garden, because the garden had to be watered. So it's an enormous like physical endeavor that he was involved with, and wildly ambitious beyond like he spent all his time and money on this garden. And he used to grow small areas of a plant to test color, almost the way like a painter would test color out. And then, so there were like little areas that were just test gardens with all the colors that he was thinking about before he then like did the combinations. So I think he was pretty highly involved. Once he had the staff of 6 gardeners, like late in his life, then he met with the head gardener several times a day. They would walk the garden together. So I think it was very involved, I guess I would say. And in terms of, but the hard question of whether he sort of accepted the loss or didn't, I think it being impossible to tell is part of why those paintings still hold their meaning, or something, that it can seem in one moment like he is accepting it and in another moment like he's refusing it. And that oscillation is what keeps them alive. Yeah, I'm not keeping track, but maybe we have one more question. Is that what we have? Yes, please.
Yes, this is very fascinating. I was wondering how much, because I thought your way of thinking that, and also the way the artist also reflected what they've seen in memory, how there's the cut, but there's also the framing. And I was wondering how much the communication, yes, between you're showing different details, how your way of cutting it or framing it, also by going to the Art Institute and taking photographs and then having the photographs, how that actually impacts your own thinking about that. So not just a cut that is bridged, but also the way it sometimes, is a form of a continuity editing where the framing is not reflected, or others where it's like almost in your face. So if we think of since we talked about the garden, I was also thinking you talked about the tourists, all of the people that are there, they're cut out,
Yeah.
right? So so it was like, how does the fact that photography was already there and is in a way much about framing what you see, and especially also cutting out what you don't see, how that reflects your own thinking about the relation also between these artists.
Yeah. I think I've written some essays about photographing paintings. It's something I think about a lot. I used to be totally against it. For a long time, I was like the person in the museum who'd be like, don't take pictures. I'd be like going up to other people and be like, stop it. You're not supposed to, it flashes. And then the zeal of the converted, I got a smartphone later than everybody else. And I was like, oh my God, look at all these pictures. I can take so many pictures. But I did find there are a few things about the practice of it. One thing is that I started to find that I had a very short amount of time in museums. Life got very busy. So it's a way to look quickly and then take it home with you and keep looking when you're not there anymore. So I find that practice is very helpful. I feel like I have a much deeper relationship with the paintings that I've photographed because I can keep thinking about them in a different way. I photograph very rapidly and kind of instinctually. Like I spend a minute with a painting just looking at it without photographing. And then I photograph like really fast, kind of where my eye is going. And I make a kind of map quickly of all the details. Then later I choose out a few that I think read in a particular way. And they're all framed by the iPhone. So they're all, that's the format, but with zoom, so closer and farther. I think thinking about the history of studying paintings with photographs, I wrote a biography of Bernard Berenson, and one of the innovations of connoisseurship in his time was to use photographs. They hadn't been widely available, but he had an enormous library, 40,000 photographs of paintings. And when you can photograph paintings, you can think about paintings that are far apart in space together and far apart in time together. So it made a huge difference to art history because, even the person with the best visual memory, if they haven't seen the painting in 10 years, it's hard to say like for sure it's the same as this by the same artist who painted this other thing over here. But if you can look at two photographs, you can compare them. So the photographing becomes like standardized railroad time. It becomes a regularizer and a way of like joining things which are far apart in space and time. And so I think of it that way, that it is flattening them, and it's framing the experiences in a way that's a little bit untrue to the physical experience of really being with a painting, but it's allowing me to make a big array and think about it and move it around. And that is, to me, valuable enough that I think it's kind of worth doing. But there's a lot to say about photographing painting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. It was a real pleasure talking with you.